And welcome into the roundtable. Bill Priestley here with you. We already had Lorianne LaRocco on talking about the difficulties that are being experienced through the strike going on in Canada with the ILWU Canada and trying to resolve those situations on the West Coast at the Port of Vancouver and others. Joining us to talk about it is John D. McCown, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Maritime Strategy, and also Dr. Sal Mercagliano, who joins us as an associate professor of history at Campbell University as well from Buies Creek, North Carolina. John, let me first come to you here. As you look at the situation, obviously we're 10 days into the strike, and so far $300+ million of freight not moving per day. You can do the math and see how much that is actually impacting things as well. How do you look at the situation right now in terms of how it's impacting not only just the Port of Vancouver and the western ports in Canada, but also the supply chains that follow?
Well, Bill, it could be a real mess if it goes on. I guess the good news is it'll be nothing comparable to what a full shutdown of the U.S. West Coast would be. But I looked at the numbers. Vancouver and Prince Rupert together, if you kind of compare their volume versus the West Coast, the last 3 months, it's about 21%. Of West Coast inbound volume between those two. But the more relevant thing for the U.S. economy is the percentage of that really goes on to the U.S. And Vancouver has some good data in terms of their Pacific loads. Prince Rupert, not so much, but Prince Rupert is about 1/3 of the inbound volume is Vancouver. So if you use that assumption, and there was a Mercantor study a couple of years ago that I came across that kind of confirmed that, and also highlighted that of the Vancouver inbound loads, about 17% of that go on to the U.S. But in contrast, in Prince Rupert, about 60% of that volume goes to the U.S. So if you go through the numbers and kind of look at the Vancouver, Prince Rupert as a percentage of total westbound, it's 21%. But the more relevant number perhaps is the U.S. cargo, and that works out to about 6% of West Coast. So, the real mess, I guess, right now is for the ships that were routed there. And the news reports are saying that the unions have indicated in Seattle and the West Coast that they will not handle those ships that they divert. Certainly, as we speak, loads that are coming to the U.S. are presumably being already redirected to vessels that go to the U.S. So that won't be a problem. But those vessels that are starting to arrive that were destined, that's a bit of a mess, and that could have some gridlock, and as we've learned recently, that could have all sorts of ramifications.
Definitely, there, Sal.
So that's kind of my overview.
Yeah, Sal, as you look at the situation, obviously, again, as John mentioned, not the seriousness if this happened in LA Long Beach, if the U.S. versions of the ILWU decided to go on strike. But this does put a bit of a hiccup in a lot of supply chains as we move forward. How do you look at the situation as an overview?
Is Willie Adams take a flight up there from the ILWU from the West Coast, giving the solidarity with Canada. We've seen other labor unions do the same exact thing. And my concern is, we don't have an agreement yet on the West Coast. We have a tentative agreement. It's got to go to the locals. And if the West Coast strike for Canada starts getting some traction and they start getting a better advantage through this, then does that impact the negotiations and the ratification of the agreement on the West Coast? Again, we've seen this before where any sort of little disruption in the supply chain causes hiccups down the road. Now, we should note that the passenger trade is unaffected by this in Canada, and so is the grain and ore trade. That is protected. The grain and ore trade is protected by law in Canada. You cannot strike against that. So what we're basically talking about here is containers moving in and out of the ports. But obviously that is going to have an impact, as John so eloquently mentioned there in the data.
John, as you look at this, and one of the questions that I brought up to Lorianne LaRocco when we had her on earlier is the fact that the timing of this is, not the greatest in the world in terms of quote unquote peak season. If you have seen Henry Byers' most recent article, looks like peak season has come and gone in the shipping industry, and we're headed for this lull of a dull second half of 2023 right now. That being said, though, if this was supposed to be the height of it, this is certainly not the time that anybody wanted to see a strike there as well.
That's correct, Bill. Of course, really, any time a strike like this is a problem. But the seasonality in the container business isn't quite what folks sometimes assume. I mean, each one of the quarters, I think the biggest quarter is 26% of volume. The smallest quarter is like 23, 24%. But anytime something like this happens, it just isn't good. And people kind of don't realize how long supply chains are and how long it kind of takes to change them. But unfortunately, what we often see is once supply chains adjust or change, you can't expect them to go back when the catalyst that might have led to that disappears. So it's really a bad situation, and one would certainly hope that this is resolved quickly, and we certainly hope that this doesn't have any spillover effects and kind of somehow upset what's going on in the U.S., as Sal said.
Sal, one of the things we noted about, we covered fairly extensively, of course, was the length of the negotiation that it took the West Coast ports to come to with the ILWU before they got this tentative agreement. Not sure exactly how long the negotiations have been going on north of the border, but is this a contentious point that they've been going on for a long time? And with that being said, chances here for things to get, as we don't hope to happen, things to get dirty, and as a result, be reflected back into the American situation where you could see perhaps these local groups not ratify the agreement.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at how this played out, I mean, it followed very similar to what we saw between the ILWU and the PMA. The BCMEA is basically a very similar organization to the PMA, made up of the shipping companies, the terminal operators. And so what we're seeing is a lot of finger pointing right now. We're seeing the dueling statements, much like we saw with the ILWU and the PMA coming out, everybody pointing fingers at each other. And we know that Canada has a mediation service that's already in there trying to reconcile what the differences are between the two. And the big issue here is so much trade goes through Vancouver for Canada. It's an inordinate amount. It is like LA, Long Beach, pile on New York, New Jersey onto it. It is a massive amount of trade that goes through. And the shutdown of Vancouver has that potential to really disrupt Canada across the entire provinces. And again, because of the way our systems are, and we're so integrated in with the Canadian system, it's going to spill over. We're already seeing car manufacturers, which have assembly lines in Canada, on delays right now because they're not receiving the parts they need. That's going to spill over across the border because of the agreements we have that allow the free flow of goods between the countries. So this has a spillover effect. Most Americans probably not paying much attention to this, but they're going to start seeing this manifest itself in the stores right now. And as John mentioned, we've seen a slowdown the second half of goods right now, but we're expecting maybe an earlier restart to this than we normally would. So this disruption is coming at a really key point right now. And I think it has the potential to cause big disruptions further down the chain.
Excuse me, John, as you look at this, when you see, of course, you mentioned that some vessels have already been rerouted to other ports to try and get in their freight into either the United States or into Canada. Those that are already there, of course, as you mentioned, the signal went out to say that those vessels would not be serviced if they came to ports of America. Lorianne LaRocca reported that at least one of them, it appears, is going to be serviced as it comes down into the United States. But that being said, how does this change? We already had this idea of diversification of supply chain before we saw with LA Long Beach just a couple of years ago in San Pedro Bay. And now all of a sudden, then maybe some of those offers again coming in towards Vancouver. And now you have this operation up there. How does this change your mind as a shipper as you try to look for a place to land your freight on the West Coast?
Well, all shippers are taking careful note of this, not only the people that control the day-to-day movements, but their own respective gold carpet or executive areas. And each time you have something like that, that kind of goes into the book, if you will, kind of the analysis of where is it that we want to have our containers go through. Because again, the ripple effect to shippers on something like this, and Sal mentioned the car industry, you just shudder to kind of think the problems. The Canada and the U.S. have a giant business of car manufacturing and components kind of moving from one country to another. And so to the extent that this is, most of the cargo in Vancouver, as Sal said, goes to Canada, but to the extent that it upsets something that ties into us, it flows over us. So I didn't hear the news that one vessel will be worked in the U.S. I think that is excellent. Certainly the port of Seattle, more than any, now has capacity and could kind of use that business. And I think the notion of somehow having shipper freight kind of stuck on a container, I would hope that reason would let more of those vessels actually be worked. I did hear, and I haven't had confirmation of it, but there was one news article that I think said an MSC vessel is already turned around and is headed back to China, which is really just kind of crazy and throws all sorts of wrinkles into the supply chain. So, this is a concerning thing. And again, the putting aside the direct impact of the strike, it's really that backup and that gridlock and the impact it has just kind of becomes geometrical at each node, and it's just an unfortunate event.
Sal, looking ahead now, obviously. Yeah, Sal, looking ahead as we kind of look down the supply chain, at least just a little bit, obviously the Port of Vancouver, serviced there by Canadian National and Canadian Pacific, or CPKC, I guess at this particular point as well, looking at their tonnage as they will be transporting those goods eastward and southward. How do you see them being affected by this at all?
Well, I think one of the things that we've talked about with LA, Long Beach, and the West Coast was diversions of ships to the East and Gulf Coast of the United States. We saw that happen quite a bit. You can't really do that with Canada because Halifax, Newfoundland, New Brunswick doesn't have the container facilities for it.
And but it's not like you can go through the North Pole either.
No, you can't go that way either. So, I mean, the Northwest Passage isn't really the best place to go. But again, they do have an agreement down in Mexico, and that'll be an interesting thing to see whether or not they take that Mexican agreement, go down to the West Coast Mexican ports that are connected by Kansas City, the Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Railways, and start moving freight that way into the United States. Now you're crossing multiple borders. The capacity is not there yet in terms of rail capacity to do that, but you may start seeing that as their alternative, using those Mexican ports on the West Coast and start moving freight through the United States into Canada that way. And I think that's the next move you're going to see start developing here.
So it's going to be quite interesting as LA Long Beach's nemesis seemed to be the Panama Canal. It looks like Vancouver's is going to be the west coast of Mexico. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. It's going to be interesting. Hopefully we get this strike resolved fairly soon so we don't have to talk about it that much more, but it could be a very sticky situation. Thanks so much for sticking around.
Thank you.